Christians suck at handling slavery in the Bible. There are three really big errors that I've noticed sort of in the popular apologetic scene. First, there is a lot of historical confusion, saying things like, oh, Old Testament slavery isn't real slavery, or it was just like owning a credit card or something like that. Second are heretical claims, such as the Bible is immoral, or that was in the Old Testament, we can ignore it, or slavery was wrong then, or wasn't wrong then, but it is wrong now, moral relativism. And the third one is just some outright horrible conclusions, such as, well, you know, I mean, slavery, is it really that bad? So these are three really big problems, and we have to do better. I propose the following thesis. Slavery is evil and inhumane. This does not need an argument. If you want to dispute this, go get some help. In contrast, the biblical laws, they are good and humanitarian. Now, this may seem rather paradoxical. How can something that regulates something evil be good and humanitarian? Well, I would argue that we actually have a category in our heads that's pretty close to this paradox. So consider the Geneva Conventions. I don't think anybody here is going to dispute they are humanitarian. Arguably, they are the pinnacle expression of humanitarian international law from the human race. And their purpose is to limit the atrocities of war. War, which is, I believe we can all agree after last week, evil and inhumane. But things like the Geneva Convention that prescribe boundaries, those are good and humanitarian. Even though the Geneva Conventions do not outlaw warfare altogether. So it's easy for us to understand the humanitarian logic undergirding the Geneva Conventions because they are written in our time and in our culture. But it is a much harder sell, I believe, to say that something that is as ancient and as foreign as the Hebrew Bible is itself humanitarian. So my goal today is to help you, sort of help elucidate the underlying humanitarian logic in the slavery laws in the Hebrew Bible. And we're going to start with what is arguably the most egregious verse in the entire Old Testament, if not the entire Bible. If you have your Bible with you, please open to Exodus chapter 21 and beginning with verse 20. I will put it up here on the screen, but if you do have a Bible, please follow along because we will be doing a lot of Bible. So, beginning in verse 20. When a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod, and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be punished. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is not to be punished, for the slave is his money. Or in some translations say the slave is his property. Now, if you have ever heard a polemical atheist come out and rail against the morality of the Bible, this verse is a core staple in their arsenal. And for good reason. If anything causes us to recoil in horror, it's something like this. Are you saying you can beat your slave as much as you want as long as he gets up the next day because he's your property? But to understand the logic of the law, we have to enter the mindset of the original ancient audience. And I will say up front, I am not trying to gaslight you into thinking that slavery is okay, all right? So just go with me here. In the ancient Near East, it was a given that physical discipline was necessary, not just for workers, such as slaves, but also for children. You may have heard the familiar proverb, whoever spares the rod hates his son, but whoever loves him is diligent to reprove him. The rod, in view, is that same rod that's up here. Same exact word, very similar understanding of the punishment. And so what we see in this passage is not the institution of beating a slave, but a limitation on an already widely accepted established disciplinary procedure. Should the enslaver strike his enslaved worker to death, he will be punished. Now there is some ambiguity about how this word punished is translated. Some say avenged, but the majority report is that this punishment is in fact the death penalty, life for life. And because this is the death penalty, it's important to be sure that the death was intentional by the enslaver's hand. If the enslaved person survives a day or two, this is important, before dying, then the law presumes that the enslaver was not trying to kill him and that some other intervening factor resulted in his death. Perhaps he became terminally ill, he had an infected wound, maybe his appendix burst, something like that that was unrelated to the beating or ancillary to it. And so in this case, the law would take the presumption that the enslaver was not acting with murderous intent and that the economic loss from losing a laborer is sufficient punishment enough. If we go down in the passage, in the same chapter, down to verse 26, we can see a little bit more light in this. So if you'll continue reading with me, Exodus 26 and 27. When a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free. For the eye's sake, if he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free for the tooth's sake. So if in the course of physical discipline the enslaver knocks out an eye or a tooth, then the enslaved merits his freedom. And it's very likely that this eye or tooth are merely representative, but they are not exhaustive of the types of injury in view. So, for example, in a parallel passage in Leviticus 24, when a man causes disfigurement in his neighbor, as he has done, it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, as he has disfigured a man, he shall be disfigured. Other parallel laws, such as the Code of Hammurabi, include similar such punishments. So it's not just that it's restricted to only an eye and only a tooth, but those are representative of a broader class of serious injury. So reading these laws together, we can see the internal logic, okay? And I've got a little flow chart for you. So first, did an enslaved person die after a disciplinary beating? If not, then we have to ask the question, was he injured? Did he suffer a bone fracture? Did his eye get knocked out? Did his tooth get knocked out, etc.? And if the answer is no in that case, then there's no further action. This would be considered a normal disciplinary beating within the context of the ancient Near East. Same thing you would give your kid, you would also give your slave, okay? However, if there was a serious injury, such as an eye, tooth fracture, etc., then the enslaved merits his freedom. Now, if the enslaved died after a disciplinary beating, then we have to ask the question, was it immediate? And if it was immediate, then we know for a fact that that the enslaver acted with murderous intent. And he is guilty of murder, and rabbinic tradition says that he should be beheaded. Was that practiced at the time of Moses? Who knows? But if it wasn't immediate and there was a gap of time, then the law says, well, we shouldn't rush to judgment here and say that this guy was a murderer. And so because of that, we're not going to give him the death penalty. So this is actually the reverse interpretation of what a lot of polemicists would say, which is you can beat your slave and as long as he gets up, you're fine. Rather, what it's saying is if he dies and it's been a couple days, it may have been something other than the beating that caused his death. But in that scenario, if a slave was beat to the point where he needed several days to recover, he's probably already seriously injured. And if he gets up, he's going to get set free. Does that make sense? All right, any comments or questions about sort of the logic here? Okay. So to see this in better relief, let's take a brief look at some roughly contemporaneous law codes. So I mentioned the term the ancient Near East earlier. This is the ancient Near East. This is the land of Canaan, later Israel, where we have our Mosaic Torah. That's what we're talking about today. Over here we have the land of Sumer, and we have some popular law codes over here. These are two preserved law codes. I believe it's the laws of Lipit Ishtar, and the laws of Ur-Nama. We get over here to Babylon. We have two laws, the famous Code of Hammurabi. That's this black obelisk here. And here we have a collection called the Laws of Eshnunna. Then we get into Assyria, where we have the creatively named Laws of Assyria. And then finally we get to the land of the Hittites, where we have the creatively named Hittite laws. So these are roughly contemporaneous. All of these were written before the Mosaic Torah. But they all are roughly in the same like late bronze, time period, okay? And so when scholars are doing comparative analysis, they usually bring these into conversation with each other, and we actually see that there are very similar codes that show up in a lot of them, almost verbatim. So we just talked about how in the Hebrew Torah that if a master beat his slave, the slave either goes free if he's injured, or the master will be killed if he kills his slave. So with these law codes in mind then, here is a comprehensive survey of all the non-Hebrew laws where the slaves are protected from their masters. That's right, there aren't any. So Gregory Kirakino, I think that's how his name is pronounced, he notes that one of the most important features of the cuneiform slave laws is that they did not deal with the treatment of injury of slaves by their owners, since chattel slaves were considered the property of their owners. It is clear from many private documents of the Old Babylonian period that owners could mutilate their slaves, although if owners killed their slaves or seriously injured their slaves, this would mean that the owners would suffer a financial loss. Therefore, owners would be reluctant to injure and maim and kill their slaves, but even though to do so was not generally considered illegal. Nahum Sarna, he is a scholar of the Old Testament. He also notes this law, the protection of slaves from maltreatment, is found nowhere else in the entire existing corpus of the ancient Near Eastern legislation. Now, importantly, there were laws on the books, especially in Hammurabi, for what happens if another person were to kill a master's slave. So here is one such example. This is from Laws of Hammurabi 115 and 116. I'm simplifying. It's a really complicated case law, but basically, if you have a master and another man beats his slave to death for whatever reason, then you go down this decision tree. If the orange guy, if he's also a slave, then he will pay a third mina of gold to the master. If he's a freeborn man, then his son will be killed in place. This is the logic that's in place. But the reason for this is not for any humanitarian concern of the dead slave. It is to compensate the economic and material loss of the master whose property rights have been violated. So in summary, the underlying logic for these cuneiform laws, and especially Code of Hammurabi, is all of the laws that are protecting slaves are there to protect the property rights of the master. But the Hebrew laws uniquely protect the human rights of the slaves. So, are there any comments about this first part here, or questions? Are you convinced? Okay, good enough. I'll take it. Now, like I said, there are not any laws on the books in these cuneiform texts concerning protections of slaves from their masters, but there are copious laws about what to do with runaway slaves. So we'll look again at the Code of Hammurabi. If a man takes a slave outside of the city, in an effort for him to escape, he gets the death penalty. If you harbor a runaway slave in your house, death penalty. If you return a runaway slave, then you're rewarded with 2 shekels of silver. But if you fail to return that runaway slave, guess what happens? Believe it or not, it is in fact the death penalty, yes. Yes. Now, notably, Hammurabi is usually, of these law codes, is considered one of the more strict codes. So we can check over here at the Hittite laws. So the Hittite laws, they say if you return a runaway slave, depending on how far away he is, you get a different reward, okay? So if he's nearby, you get shoes. If he's on the near side of the river, 2 shekels, far side, 3 shekels, further away, 6 shekels. And if he goes all the way into an enemy country and you retrieve him, you get to keep him, right? And if you harbor a runaway in your house, you don't get the death penalty, but you do have to pay 1 month's wages, which is 12 shekels for men and 6 shekels for women. So as you can see, that's a pretty steep fine considering some of the pricing that you see for the reward. And then the third one, this is from the laws of Lippet Ishtar, which says that if you harbor a runaway slave in your house, then you have to surrender one of your slaves, and if you don't have any slaves, then you have to pay 15 shekels, okay? So now, with that in mind, let's look at a comprehensive list of all of the Hebrew laws regarding the return of runaway slaves. That's right. Once again, there's nothing here. In fact, we have the direct opposite. So if you will turn in your Bible to Deuteronomy 23, beginning with verse 15, let's read it here. You shall not give up your master, or you shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place where he shall choose within one of your towns. Where it pleases him best, you shall not oppress him. So in summary, we have the cuneiform laws. Runaways cannot be harbored. You will either get the death penalty or you will get a very steep fine. In contrast, the Hebrew laws say runaways must be harbored. Now, I could continue going down law by law on this and say that, here's this law, here's this law, here's this law. But I think that's going to give the wrong idea, because we're not trying to do a quantitative analysis that on the whole, each of these laws sort of add up to be slightly better than the other. We would miss one of the most defining and unique features about the Hebrew Bible, which is that it uniquely cultivates empathy in its very structure. And I'm just going to focus on 2 points, but this is something we could spend literally hours talking about. One of the unique features is the pervasive use of the second person imperative. So what is the second person imperative? It means you must do something. Thou shalt not do this. Thou shalt not do that, right? But that's actually a very weird way to structure a law. Have any of you ever read the Code of Federal Regulations for the United States? How many of them are in the second person? Okay, some of the pre-law students have, yeah. How many of them are in second person? Yeah, none of them, right? We don't structure our law codes like this. Hammurabi doesn't structure his law codes like this. It's a very bizarre thing. Now, obviously, not all of the Hebrew laws are in the second person, but what exactly is the rhetorical goal in having something like that? Well, I can illustrate this with an example from American law. So most of our laws are written in the sort of neutral third-person perspective. If a person does this, or if a man is murdered, if a Texan does this, right? But there's one very, very, very famous law, the supreme law of the land, that starts with a very famous phrase that is not in the third-person indicative or in the third-person imperative. Do y'all know what that is? It's 3 words. We the people. That's right. We the people. That's one of the most famous ones. And think about how powerful and how influential that rhetorical phrasing is. How many times have you seen protesters out saying, we the people demand this, right? Or we the people demand that. Think about how that structures our relationship with our government, right? It arguably defines our entire democratic republic in the space of 3 words. We the people. Not I the king declare this, not you generic people or anything like that, but we the people do that, right? So we recognize the rhetorical power of using those types of inclusive pronouns. And it's the same way when it comes with the imperative you that's used throughout the Hebrew Bible. Because if we read Hammurabi, it opens up with, I am the king Hammurabi, I am the shepherd of the land, I am responsible for justice and all of that kind of stuff. But in the Hebrew Bible, the impetus and the emphasis for enacting justice and for bringing about goodness in the land is put on you. What's arguably the most famous ethical imperative in the Bible? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The impetus is put on you to actually carry that out, and you are to do that in an empathetic way. Now, does anyone know where that is, that imperative? You shall love your neighbor as yourself? Where is that in the Bible? Anybody? Where? Like, yeah, what book is it in? Deuteronomy? It's in Leviticus. It's like square in the middle of that nasty part of the Bible that we all skip when we're doing our, Bible in a year plan, right? Right in the very core of it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. And it's not the only place where this happens. And it's not the only way in which the Hebrew Bible is structured to bring about these empathetic concerns. Because the you that's in view in the Bible is not just those people that were liberated from Egypt, but also those people and their descendants. So it continues throughout all the generations. In Deuteronomy, Moses says, you shall read this law to your children, year after year, generation after generation. So that polyvocality continues into the future generations. And the second feature that's really important is that this Hebrew empathy is rooted in the national identity as liberated slaves. As we talked about last semester, the Exodus from Egypt defines the Hebrew identity in 3 critical ways. It answers who we are, it answers who is our God, and it says where are we going. It's so central that to remove this is to remove the Hebrew identity altogether. This is a slide I stole from Ben. You can go watch his video on our YouTube from last semester about this. And so it's this empathetic concern and the second person imperative and the identity and this identity as liberated slaves from Egypt, that we get these motive clauses in Deuteronomy which tangibly impact the way that the Hebrews treat their slaves. You shall remember you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you to do this day. And he says this several times in Deuteronomy. I've given you just 4. And so we can see that rather than this random Hebrew law about beating your slaves and this random Hebrew law about runaway slaves, rather than just being isolated incidents, they actually have an organic, they're an organic outgrowth of the underlying humanitarian concern of the Bible, the Hebrews' national identity as liberated slaves, and the empathetic rhetorical structure. We talked about, why do you not beat your slaves harshly? Why are you not able to kill them? Because you in the land of Egypt were beat with rods. Do you want to be an Egyptian? No. Why do you harbor runaway slaves? Because you were runaway slaves, and you are in my land, and I give you harbor. Therefore, you give harbor to all runaway slaves that come into this land. And this is something that is unparalleled in any of the other codes that we talked about. And so, thus we return to our thesis that slavery is evil and inhumane. And as we have discussed here, the Hebrew laws governing them, they are good and they have a humanitarian motive. And yet, we are not committed to saying that these laws have a place in our world today. They served their purpose then, they restrained evil then, and now that we live in a world where slavery is mostly abolished, we do not need to institute them anymore. And so this approach clears our 3 problems that we discussed earlier. So first, has there been any historical confusion? No. I want to be very clear. The slavery I'm talking about, whatever sort of cultural assumptions you bring with that, it's real slavery. You can't say, oh, it wasn't real or it's fake or something like that. And the arguments that I've made are predicated on sort of like mainstream scholarship. Like, I haven't gone really fringe or anything like that. Have I said anything horrible? No. Slavery was evil then and it's still evil now. Okay, I think that's pretty straightforward. Finally, have I said anything heretical? Well, you might be a little uncomfortable when I just said, oh, well, that was then, this is now. The laws had a time, a place then, but they don't have a place now. And this can be sort of overplayed. In fact, early in the Christian church, one of the very first collection of heresies that the Orthodox were fighting against was a collection of heresies that in some degree said that the God of the Old Testament was evil, and that the Old Testament as a whole was evil, and that needs to be thrown away. Marcion was really famous for doing this. The Manichaeans were famous for doing this. The Gnostics to some degree, but who knows what they were thinking. They probably didn't know what they were thinking. And within that milieu, we have one of the most influential church fathers, Augustine, who in his dispute with Faustus, who's a Manichaean, makes this appeal. And this is something we can kind of take a clue in from. So I'll read this quote for you. So Augustine says that all things written in the books of the Old Testament are to be received with approval and admiration as most true and most profitable to eternal life, and that those precepts which are no longer observed outwardly are to be understood as having been most suitable in those times. Here's the key analogy here. As a sick man should not find fault with the medical treatment because one thing is prescribed today and another tomorrow, and what was at first required is afterwards forbidden, since the method of the cure depends on this progression, so the human race should not find fault with the divine prescriptions if sometimes the same observances are enjoined and sometimes an old observance is exchanged for a different kind. And so, using Augustine's analogy, we can say that just as it is objectively wrong to continue giving a cancer patient chemotherapy after she's gone into remission, so it is also objectively wrong to reinstitute laws regulating an evil practice that largely has been abolished. So in conclusion, the Hebrew Bible, though situated within a slave-holding world, it uniquely protects the humanity of the enslaved, even though its most challenging passage, as we saw at the beginning, demonstrates a humanitarianism that is absent in neighboring cultures. However, these laws are not meant to be the last word on slavery. These laws represent a step towards a world without slavery, much like the Geneva Conventions are a step towards a world without war. But is a world like that really possible? A world where there is no war, no slavery, and no oppression? And the answer is yes. That is the promise of the gospel. That is what Jesus started out to do. And this is not a hope that we just sort of look forward to as Christians. For those of us that are Christians, this isn't something we look forward to sort of in a passive way where we just wait for Jesus to come back, but we enter into his work as he has commissioned us to do, and bring that future hope into the present. And so if you are a Christian, you can go forth in full confidence that the Lamb has conquered and that the oppressive gates of hell will not prevail against his advancing kingdom. Thank you. I've left plenty of time for discussion, but my final comment is just that this is largely inspired by this book, Human Rights in Deuteronomy, by Daisy Tsai, I believe is how that's pronounced. I'd highly recommend that book if you're interested in this. Okay, so are there any follow-up comments or questions? Or we can just keep going down some rabbit hole if you would like. Okay, Caleb, would you mind bringing this around? I'm sorry if you had a question, you can't have it now. There you go. Jacob, you want to go first?
Yeah, so after Jesus came, would those Old Testament laws have been abolished and then or would those laws apply in cultures until the point at which slavery could be abolished? So like in the United States, for example, we still had slavery.
Yeah.
Would it be like those laws should have applied, but now they don't?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and I think it gets into a lot of really detailed socioeconomic questions, right? So I would think about it kind of like this. Sometimes people will object to the mission of Jesus saying, well, it didn't seem like slavery was on his agenda because he didn't come out and say in the Beatitudes, blessed is the man who frees his slave. And he uses a lot of parables that have slaves and things like that. But at the same time, we kind of have to reckon with the notion that Jesus's work isn't just limited to 3 years, right? He commissioned apostles to go and do those other things. And so I think here, when we get into the question of like Christian ethics, we have to ask the question of what are sort of the entailments of the Christian ethical system, and how is it that we can start implementing them in a sort of realistic, practical way that has lasting effect. So, and sometimes that is dependent on socioeconomic constraints. I would say that one of the entailments of Christianity is ultimately that there is no war, right? Like I think that's an entailment of that. But in the interim, we can't really abolish war. We've tried it and it doesn't work. So, as we talked about last week, you may have heard, there are perspectives on how Christians engage in war sort of in that interim perspective. So I think it is a little bit naive to say like, oh, as soon as Jesus rose from the dead, slavery should have been abolished. But rather, the perspective is that the ultimate Christian ethic had to entail the abolition of slavery worldwide in whatever form it took. But how soon and where and in what form is a very complicated socioeconomic question, I think. Oh dear, what?
Be afraid. Yeah. So you made a point to mention, like, this isn't just a quantitative analysis of here's my law that's better than your law and here's my law, but there are some laws which it is said by some people that when you do the comparison, it turns out that Hammurabi is better than the Bible. And so, example being in Hammurabi, it says, like, when you have a slave, like, you let them go after 3 years and they're gone. And in the Bible, it's 6 years with a small stipend. So, like, how do we find the, like, being nicer Hebrew model in those sketchier cases?
Yeah, this is a great question. And it's one that sets, so Tsai is, she's the one I'm kind of largely following. And this has kind of been a movement within, I guess, in the past 10 or 15 years to rectify the wrongs of previous attempts at dealing with slavery, like you said. There's an approach that says, well, Hebrew slavery was it was kinder, it was gentler, if you wanted to be a slave in the ancient Near East, you would want to be a Hebrew. That may be true, but that doesn't actually get to the underlying ethical question. And so that's why we focus on the qualitative question, which is, why do these laws do what they do? And when we look at that, like I was arguing, is that the entailment of the Hebrew system is, ultimately the reasons we have these limits are for humanitarian purposes, even if the particular numbers may be different. So in your case, there's like a surface level sort of discrepancy where Hammurabi says that debt slaves are enslaved for 3 years, whereas Hebrew laws are in 6 years. Now that targets very much the kindler, gentler. Well, this is a place where it's not kindler and gentler. But nothing about our approach actually entails that. What it's mostly focusing on is that the underlying logic and the way that it gets there is much more robust and provides sort of an ethical framework for abolition in a way that these others don't. So I think the way to do it is just be honest and say, yeah, Hammurabi has a shorter debt term. There may be reasons for that. It could very well be the case that a smaller economy like Israel, that paying off a debt just takes longer because you can't produce as much economic worth in that smaller economy than in a larger economy like Hammurabi. Or it could just be something kind of like, well, we all agree there has to be some limit, and then we just disagree on what sort of that limit is. I'm trying to think of a good example. So something like, for example, if we were to look at driving ages today, everyone agrees, well, we shouldn't let 5-year-olds drive, but waiting until you're 40 to drive to get a license, that's a problem. So where do we draw that line? Okay, or same thing with like drinking age, things like that, right? So some countries will say, well, if you're 16, you can get a license. Some say 14, you can get a license, things like that. It's not like, oh, well, we need to add these things together. We just have to look at the underlying logic is the same, but because there really isn't like, it's not like you turn 15 and suddenly you're responsible enough to drive a car. It's just you have to draw the line somewhere, and that's a reasonable place to do it. I don't know. That was a bit rambling, but I hope that was helpful. Okay. David.
So I've noticed a kind of a running theme across the semester's topic so far, which is there's some problematic thing here, and the Bible is coming in to make it not as bad as it would have been otherwise. So it's not like the Bible creates slavery and is perpetuating slavery. It's coming into a pre-existing institution and trying to moderate it as best it can.
Yeah.
And we said a similar thing about war with Jacob's presentation. We've said similar things with sex and singleness with Caleb and David Cates' presentations. And I want to ask if there's like a parallel here going on with basically every kind of human evil there is. So could you say the same thing about just any, insert bad thing in the world here? Is the analysis you're doing here of slavery cross-applicable to that kind of analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a very robust tradition in Christian ethics called I don't know if this is exactly what it's called, but I think it's called something like post-lapsarian analysis. And essentially the idea is that everything is trying to discern which parts of the world are effects of the fall of humanity. And those are the things that we have to sort of take a complicated position with, versus what are the things that are present in humanity as it was originally created. And that's what we sort of strive for. So universally, I was actually reading Calvin on this. So John Calvin's writing, in the 1500s, and his analysis on slavery is literally, look, God did not make this. This has no place in the Garden of Eden. Everywhere in the Bible, this is treated as something that's negative and bad. It's a punishment. So this is something that we need to get rid of as soon as we can. And then he goes on to say that those idiots that are getting the Africans, what on earth are they doing? They're really stupid for doing that, right? And so that is a really good heuristic for saying, as a Christian, is this something that is bad or not? You can say, well, is this something we would expect to see in a pre-fall world or in a post-fall world? So with war, there is no war in the Garden of Eden, unless you include like Adam's defense of the garden against outside threats or something kind of like that, right? But there's no war between human beings. They're meant to be perfectly complementary, perfectly aligned with each other, etc. And in a case like slavery, Adam and Eve, they have no slave relation. There's not even a hint of anything like that. And of course, the first instance of slavery is as a curse in Genesis 9 in that case. And so, yeah, when the Bible's dealing with these things, it's coming into a world that's post-fall, except for Genesis 1, right? And starting to sort of work through how do we undo that curse. This is why in that beautiful hymn, the Christmas hymn, was it Joy to the World, right? Where it says that Jesus's effects will restore everything so far as the curse is found, which is like all of human society. As a good Calvinist, I have to say, yeah, total depravity also applies to societal institutions too. So, all right, good question. Yes.
So in the same verse that Michael was talking about earlier, where it talks about the 6 years and then setting them free,
Can you give a reference real quick for those of us that want to
yes.
follow along?
So I'm reading from Deuteronomy 15:12. If your kinsman, a Hebrew man or woman, is sold to you, then he shall serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year you shall set him free. And it goes on to talk about the provisions that he will give. Why do you think it's like? How do you justify it only speaking to kinsmen or Hebrews and not applying to outside nations that might become slaves?
This is a great question, and we can see a little bit of that logic in Leviticus 25. So I will make a note that if you start getting into the weeds on this stuff, the composition of the Hebrew Bible quickly becomes like non-trivial. Like it is enormously complicated. Why are these laws repeated? Why are they parallel? Who's talking when? All those kinds of things. So to this point, let's talk about Leviticus 25, 39, okay? It says, if your brother becomes poor beside you and sells himself to you, you shall not make him serve as a slave. He shall be with you as a hired servant and as a sojourner. He shall serve with you until the year of Jubilee. Then he shall go out from you, he and his children with him, and go back to his own family and return to the possession of his fathers, and presumably with the provisions of Deuteronomy. Here's the logic. Here's why you let the Hebrews go free. Verse 42, for they are my servants whom I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over them with harshness, but fear your God. Now here's the verse that makes everyone deeply uncomfortable. Verse 44, as for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are round about you. You may also buy among the strangers who sojourn with you and their families that are with you who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession. You shall make slaves of them, but over your brethren, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another with harshness. So the logic here is that the Hebrew people, in virtue of being they're belonging to Yahweh. Yahweh is the one who liberated them from Egypt. He is the one who has jurisdiction over what can and can't be done with a Hebrew. There are other things about if you sell a Hebrew to a foreign nation, you're in like really, really bad position, because that's on top of being like inhumane and evil, it's also like a direct affront to God because of that kind of stuff, right? But the logic is that the foreigners, right, remember, God has made a covenant with a people and also with a land, right? So the land, the people, God, these are all sort of intertwined. So if you're not inside the land and if you're not part of that covenant community, then you are not a beneficiary to the covenant blessing, which would be, you cannot be made a slave in that respect. So that's kind of the internal logic. Hebrew slaves, they belong to God, they're God's people, or they're Yahweh's people, and they cannot be enslaved by each other, and they cannot be enslaved by outsiders. But foreigners who serve different gods and and don't have this covenant, they can serve as perpetual slaves. So that's the internal logic. Now, that sounds horrible and terrible, and yeah, I mean it is, right? Like we don't have to say, oh, actually this is good. No, it's not, it's terrible. But I will leave you with this, which is something very weird. So I think that there is actually a conceptual incoherence in the idea of taking a foreign slave and as a Hebrew and not setting him free. And in virtue of this, it's in Exodus 12, 43, okay? So in Exodus 12, 43, it says this, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, This is the ordinance of the Passover, right? So the Passover is the celebration of the Exodus from Egypt, right? It includes a bunch of other stuff, okay? No foreigner shall eat of it, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. Okay, think about that for a second. No foreigner may eat the Passover, but every slave that you have bought with money may eat of the Passover after you have circumcised him. So let's think about this for a second. The Hebrews, they're obviously celebrating the Passover, and they are not slaves bought for money. So it's not talking about slaves. Or sorry, it's not talking about Hebrews. And it says we're not talking about foreigners that travel through the land. It's specifically saying the slaves, the non-Hebrew slaves that you purchase. They are circumcised. What does that mean? It makes them part of the community. That is the covenant sign of the community. This for us for those of us that are Christians, this is like being baptized. Like that's what it's to be initiated into the community. They may eat of the Passover. So they are celebrating the liberation from Egypt. And the Passover starts with, why is this night different from any others? Because the Lord our God brought us out of Egypt, etc. So they are participating in that ritual. So as a Christian, I think of this like, how can I look at somebody who is baptized and celebrating the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper with me? How are they not a Christian? How are they not in the same Christian covenant as I am? And I think about this in the same way. How is it that these foreign slaves are not in the Hebrew covenant if they have the sign of the covenant and they're participating in the ritual of the covenant? So I think that there is actually like a fundamental incoherence in the law itself that's put there intentionally, that the more you think about that, you realize it doesn't make sense to perpetuate them. Now, as far as whether this law was enacted, whether any rabbi noticed that, I don't know, probably. I don't think that we cannot make the historical inference, therefore the foreigners were let free or anything like that. But I do think it shows that, like, the closer you look at these laws, there is like an irreconcilable tension there that cannot be maintained unless you actually ultimately get rid of slavery. It's the same exact logic if you read in Philemon, whenever Paul is wrestling through how can a Christian master and a Christian slave be brothers in Christ. And you can't reconcile that together. Okay, that was a very long-winded answer. Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so this is more on the level of the framework that you sort of set out here. You know what I've been thinking about for the last 6 months. I've been thinking
Only
about
6 months.
Yeah, longer than that, but you know what I mean. The question of gay marriage, of course.
Right.
So it seems to me like this sort of rubric might imply that the restrictions on homosexuality were less about the fact that it's gay and more about the fact that it's associated with cultic worship practices. You know, in Kings and Samuel, it mentioned several times that there's a problem because male cult prostitutes are running around everywhere and it's bad. So just curious on like preliminary, what would you think about this framework being applied?
Yes, as someone who has read approximately 0.5% of the literature that you've read on this topic, let me give you the definitive answer. So it goes back to what I think we were talking about with David, is that the Christian ethical framework is largely to ruminate on, or sort of reflect on what's in the Garden of Eden as kind of the standard, right? Because the other sort of related thing is how does this framework not just become sort of just determinism? Whatever my current ethical beliefs are, that's where it's been leading all along, and we finally arrived, right? How do we avoid this arbitrariness? And so traditionally in Christian ethics is to look at the Garden of Eden and see how did God, because that's set out as like this is the ideal human, this is the ideal human relationship with God, nature, and each other. So the standard sort of approach for that is to say, it seems like in Genesis that this is like an endorsement of like heterosexual normativity for sexual union between human beings, right? A couple of weeks ago, Caleb was talking about the same thing with complementarianism, right? Like the relationship between men and women. However we understand that, there is an ideal, like the text is saying, there is an ideal that's there. It may be very difficult to interpret. There's a lot of controversy about it. So when engaging with that question, I think it is consistent to say, like it's not special pleading or anything to say that based off of this reading of Genesis, this is my understanding of human sexuality that's informed by, Genesis 1 and 2. Everything after that that doesn't conform to that standard is, in some degree, illicit. This is the standard argument against polygamy, for example, right? No polygamy. In fact, polygamy is basically entailed as impossible in the Garden of Eden, and then we see it afterwards, right? That's kind of the argument. So depending on how strong you find that argument, then you could say there are later restrictions, but the ethical grounding, like the grounding for why heterosexuality isn't because there was all of these cult prostitutes that were doing crazy things. This is how the Garden of Eden ethic sort of outlines what human sexuality is supposed to be like. And you've obviously have read this argument before, and so it gets really complicated, especially because of the fact that Genesis 1 consists of like this much of the Bible, right? So how much can you do on that? But I think it's a good point though. And I will just make another quick comment that just on a personal note, that I actually kind of do I worry a lot about how future generations will perceive my ethical decision making, because right now, today in this room, it's super easy for us to say, those guys doing slavery, what a bunch of goofs and clowns. How could they have done something silly like that? When 150 years ago, this was like a super hot debate in America that resulted in a little war that we had, right? Split brother against brother, highly divisive. At the time, not obvious, very obvious to us now. Questions about homosexuality or even things like abortion, I would say, those are the top two that I think, we are really, really divided, and we don't have culturally this sort of universal agreed clarity on what the correct answer is. And so I'm always burdened to do ethical decision making in a way such that even if I get it the wrong answer, my descendants will say, you know what, he did a goof, but he really tried. He did it with compassion. He did it with seriousness, right? And I think that homosexuality is one of those questions. Okay. I seem to keep pontificating. I need to get this down to 30 seconds.
I have two questions. Yes. So the first goes back to...
Can you speak up just a tad?
Okay.
Just so I can hear you.
I have two questions. So the first goes back to 2 questions ago when Exodus 12.
Yeah.
And were the Israelites required to circumcise their foreign slaves, or was that just an option available to them? And then what happened to the woman? And then the second question is a bit more generic, but if slavery, what is evil, as you have repeatedly affirmed in this presentation, why didn't God just go all the way and outlaw it?
Yes, very good question. So for the first one, I'll say this sort of issue that I just talked about with the Exodus 12 and Passover. I only found this out I only noticed this myself last week. I have not been able to turn up any literature talking about it, so I don't want to comment on that. If they were required to circumcise their slaves, that I don't know off the top of my head, but I do know that was definitely normative for a couple of reasons. The first one being if we look in Genesis 12, when Abraham talks to God and says, who will be my heir? I can't remember the guy's name, but he says, I don't have any sons, my heir is my slave, right? And Belahaz, that sounds right, yeah. And we can see in the institution of circumcision with Abraham, he does circumcise everybody, including his slaves, including Belahaz, right? So I think it was certainly normative. I don't know if it was required. The second part related to this is there's a factor when it comes to enslaving people called denationalization, right? Because you were part of this other culture, now you're part of our culture. And importantly, this isn't debt slavery, this is permanent slavery. It's extraordinarily painful here in America, right? Because there are, African Americans today, they don't know where they come, a lot of them do not know where they come from. There's a huge effort to try and figure out, am I Ghanaian and am I Nigerian, et cetera, right? But they're basically, this is something that, I obviously am talking about as an outsider, but there is a large contingent of African Americans who say we don't really have a culture. Our culture is slavery because we were brought here and we don't know what happened before that, right? I can trace my ancestors back, to 400 or 500 years ago. I can say, yeah, I've got some Scottish and some English and all that. Many African Americans can't do that, and so their entire identity is shaped by slavery in that respect. That obviously didn't start here with us in America, but other enslaving systems were largely had some factor of denationalization. So this is where it starts to get really weird, because now when you talk about denationalizing someone in the context of the Hebrew nation, that means you circumcise them and you do Passover, right? You bring them into the nation. You are now a part of the Hebrew nation. Your God is now my God, the household God. It's not your God from whatever, it's not Marduk or whatever. You're now Hebrew in that respect. So I would think that it would certainly be normative. Is it required? That I don't know off the top of my head. So that's for that first question. Now the second question was, is slavery bad? What was it? What was it? Oh, why did God abolish slavery? Yeah, this is a good question. So this is something I think that there are like several factors involved in this. The first factor is taking God and the Bible out of it. Any progressive effort is going to be met with well, why didn't you go this far, right? Why didn't you do this? Any effort that makes progress is never going to be complete to a certain point. So, for example, if you go and talk to the the leftist club, I think they're called the DSA, they would say that the job of abolishing slavery is not done. We think, oh, we're done, we finished that, here in America we got it all put together. But they would say, no, modern slavery still exists in the form of wage slavery and in the form of the prison system, for example, right? You're probably familiar with this. Some of you have probably heard something kind of like that, right? So they would say, we haven't abolished slavery. We haven't done enough. And we need to do more in that respect. And you could critique that and say that, you can basically pick like any arbitrary point prior to that and say, well, that wasn't far enough, right? Or this isn't far enough. So in saying this, all we're saying is that the Bible is making sort of progress on that front. And the question of like, well, why not abolish it? This, I think, when we start talking about God and we start talking about the sort of implications, I think it leads us down something that's deeply implausible. Because you can start asking the question, if God, I think it ultimately leads to the question, if God acts, why doesn't he just basically bring about the new creation now, right? Why doesn't he abolish slavery? Why doesn't he why doesn't he abolish war, Why doesn't he get rid of all the sickness and suffering and pain in the world? Why doesn't God heal amputees? Well, if he does heal amputees, why doesn't he heal kids with cancer, right? Like on and on and on it goes, until eventually I think the terminus becomes kind of a reductio, which is you're ultimately just asking, well, why doesn't Jesus come back now, right? And that to me, it just seems to me that that's just not a very compelling argument. And because that's not a compelling argument, and because that is the logical conclusion of that, I just don't find it particularly persuasive. And I also don't feel the need to sort of say like, well, this was the most God could do at the time, or something like that, right? In that respect. So I think asking, well, why didn't God abolish slavery? You could certainly go back and do some back-of-the-envelope calculations and say, oh, well, it probably would have tanked the economy. It probably would have introduced more human suffering than we could imagine. That's certainly the case now. Like, there are several human rights abuses that we have ingrained in our economic system that if we got rid of them overnight would basically kill millions and millions of people, right? Classic example of this is like petroleum, right? So if we all know petroleum's killing us, we know the microplastics is destroying us, we know that burning oil is destroying our planet, we know that toxic fumes are killing everything, like we know all this, right? And yet if we just yoinked petroleum overnight, untold horrors would entail. So I think that there's a degree of plausibility with that. And then the final thing I'll say on this, to continue pontificating, is I think it does say something that the ancient society that undoubtedly had the most incentive to abolish slavery, which is the Hebrews, the fact that their very first law is about how to enslave Hebrews says to me, gives a lot of plausibility that this just was not a practical option on the table at that time. So that's kind of what I think on that. Okay, one more.
Okay.
Uh-oh. Okay.
I want to ask about corn.
Corn?
Yes, in the law of Hammurabi, one of the ones you state, if anyone have a claim for corn or money upon another and imprison him, if the prisoner die in prison a natural death, the case shall go no further. What does this have to do with slavery?
So you have to read the second law, which it says,
Oh.
yeah, it says if the prisoner, it's the key part here is if you have a debt and then you're in prison because of that debt, if you die in prison of a natural death, it's no problem. But if the guy who's in charge of you beats you to death, then your master has to be paid for your loss. Okay. I appreciate your time. We're going to wrap up now. We're going to go around out this door, around the corner, and continue talking at the Chick-fil-A. But I appreciate your time this evening.